And we are live once again. There was a top story up on Drudge a few hours ago. This new study, or new warning, emergency declaration put out by scientists. The headline up on Summit.News: scientists demand Westerners have fewer children to stop climate change. Yes, it's bug world order once again. Over 11,000 scientists have signed an emergency declaration urging Westerners, and I say Westerners because this study, this warning, was published in a Western scientific journal, then amplified by the Western media. This is not directed towards people in the Middle East or people in Africa or migrant communities within the West. This is firmly, solely directed towards Westerners. And they say that Westerners have to have fewer children in order to stop climate change. Well, there's one problem with that. Westerners aren't having any children. Even if you believe in man-made climate change, which of course we've debunked as hysterical, alarmist propaganda, which is merely being recycled on a 50-year cycle, the biggest surge in population growth is occurring in Africa and the Middle East, and amongst migrants from those countries who now live in the West, who we are importing in the millions and millions. The scientists write that global population, quote, must be stabilized and ideally gradually reduced within a framework that ensures social integrity. Basically, that's a euphemism for saying we need massive population reduction now. Even though the UN's own figures, which they love to cite when it comes to climate change and global warming, show that the human population will get to about 9 billion by the year 2050, and then it will gradually decline after that. But this is odd that it's directed towards Westerners, given that in Europe, for example, women are having on average just 1.6 children, and in North America, 1.9 children, which is well below the replacement rate. And they've done studies in the UK. I think Breitbart wrote about this recently, where within the migrant communities in the UK, the ones who've recently moved there, are having way more children than the replacement rate would require, and native British people are having way less. So, kind of racist to suggest that there should be less brown and black people on the planet in order to solve climate change, I would suggest. But that's certainly not a narrative that's being pushed by Bloomberg, which put out this original article. Because in Africa, women are having on average 4.5 children, and in the Middle East, it's 2.8 children above the replacement rate, of course. Many of these families are also producing similar numbers of offspring after they move to Western countries. And in fact, there's a graph, which again, the source is the UN, and they talk about the population increase heading up to 2050. The graph is in this Summit News article, and it shows that the clear majority of population increase is coming in the next 30 years or so from Africa and the Middle East. They have the purple line for Africa, which shows a good chunk there at the top. Then below that, a big red line, or a red chunk for Asia, excluding Japan and China. This graph is in the article at Summit.News. Scientists demand Westerners have fewer children to stop climate change. So the vast majority of that population increase is coming from Africa and Asia, of course, not Japan and China. China had its one-child policy, the ramifications of which are still reverberating throughout the country. I think they increased that where they could have 2 children, but it was only for basically wealthy people in China. People in Japan aren't having children, so they're not accounting for population increase. And then right down at the bottom, or almost at the bottom in green, is Europe, which again, how much of this population increase from Europe is going to come from migrant communities? Because European natives are not having children. Their population is declining. So those figures obviously must include the increase in population from migrants who have migrated to Europe. Same case as with the Middle Eastern bloc, which is shown in red there, and the African bloc shown in purple. So the only people who are really having children above their replacement rate and supposedly causing climate change are going to be the Middle East and Africa as they continue to develop. So it's quite racist, in my view, to suggest that there should be less black and brown people on the planet. In addition, and this is something I exposed in my video about Extinction Rebellion, the entire overpopulation argument is alarmist hysteria. You can go back to 1968 for the foundational text on this piece of alarmism, which was environmentalist Paul Ehrlich in his 1968 book, The Population Bomb, which ludicrously claimed, and this was repeated right up until the end of the 80s, in his book said, quote, hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death. That's a quote by the 1980s because of overpopulation. This was still in vogue as late as the early 2000s. Then it kind of subsided within the narrative because the actual facts of the matter were not bearing it out. In fact, I think there were studies in Indonesia where their populations are actually starting to level off because they're starting to develop. So this entire overpopulation propaganda hysteria has been alarmism from the very beginning, but they're still pushing it as part of this narrative to convince Westerners not to have children, even though they're not having children. They want you to live alone in a pod, eat bugs, never have children, and die alone. That is the bug world order. And again, the people telling you this, directing this message at Westerners, are people like Greta Thunberg, who is hanging out with Leonardo DiCaprio, the guy who literally takes private jets everywhere to pick up environmental awards, the guy who vacations on 400-foot luxury yachts owned by billionaire oil sheiks. She's hanging out with Arnold Schwarzenegger, the guy who literally has a garage full of muscle cars and tanks. That's the kind of lifestyle they're living. The kind of lifestyle you have to live is to eat bugs and never have any children. And Piers Corbyn, who is brother of Jeremy Corbyn, surprisingly, Labour leader in the UK, in a recent interview, he said, quote, climate policy is there to control you, not climate. And that's what it's all about, is population control. We had a billboard go up in London. I wrote about this last week on Summit.News. Headline, billboard in London encourages white people to sterilize themselves. And this was a billboard in North London. It says, imagine a city less crowded, do your part, get sterilized, yay! And it has 5 children on there depicted as cartoon characters, and they're all white. A noticeable and alarming lack of diversity within this advertisement. Perhaps we should report it to the Advertising Standards Authority in the UK. Not very diverse. So they literally have billboards in major European cities telling white people to get sterilized. They put out massive scientific emergency declarations aimed at Westerners. And in fact, there was another billboard in Portugal, which is posted in this same article. It says, celebrate low birth rates. Again, in countries like Portugal and Italy, all the young people are leaving. They're not having kids, and they're being left with an aging population. Why, if overpopulation is such a massive burden on the planet, is this message only being aimed at Westerners who are not having children anyway? Really makes you think, doesn't it? We'll be back in the next segment with more news. Going to talk about the Chinese social credit score, publicly shaming bad citizens for jaywalking. Thank God that we don't have this in the West, where people are publicly shamed and deplatformed for their supposed bad behavior. Or do we? We'll be back. Don't go away.